Welcome. As you can see, we're still in the time period of 1750 through about 1900. We're actually going to take it through 1920 with Latin America. Please remember that the time periods we've been looking at, 1200 through 1450, 1450 through 1750, and now 1750 through 1900, the years don't always line up exactly with those. Kind of depends on the events that are going on in the area. But what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at Latin America. Now, one of the big themes of Latin America during this time period was the move towards independence. Latin America, you will remember, gets its name because of the two groups who settle there, European groups who come into this area. And they are the Spanish and the Portuguese. Spanish and the Portuguese both speak Romance languages, meaning they derive from Latin or from Roman languages, Romance, and they derive from Latin. So the area gets known as Latin America. And it's pretty much everything from the Rio Grande south is considered Latin America. So they're going to be pushing back for their independence against Spain and Portugal during this time. Then what we're going to look at is we're going to look at what kind of countries are set up after independence movements. What happens later? All right, so what are some problems that we're going to run into during this time period? Obviously, independence is where we're going to start first. But even after independence, what's going to be the role of religion in Latin America? Are these going to be theocracies? You remember the has Greek for God, and ocracy is God for power. Word for power, sorry. So a theocracy is God power. In other words, a government run by the church. So are we going to be theocracies? What type of society are we going to have? We're going to have a more egalitarian, or are we going to remain very stratified due to race and class? But a lot to do with race. If you remember, we talked earlier about the Peninsulares, the Europeans who were born back on the Iberian Peninsula in either Spain or Portugal. Excuse me. The Creoles, who are European descendants who are born here in the Americas, the mixed race groups. Then at the bottom, we've got your African slaves and your Native Americans. Are those going to still be big issues in this part of the world? Also, what's going to be the nature of the economy? Up until this point, everybody's been pretty agricultural. There's been some commercialization. You remember in Europe with the guilds and some of the manufacturing and that kind of stuff. But it's very small. It's done out of the homes. It's done out of cottages. In fact, it's frequently known as the cottage industry. And so we're going to move to industrialization. Will these remain predominantly agricultural economies, or are they going to go industrialization? We'll answer that before all this is over too. And what form of government are they going to have? Are they going to have monarchies with kings and queens? Or are they going to go democratic and go republics, where you elect your leaders in republics? Plus, they always feel threatened. They feel threatened by other governments in the region, other than their neighbors. They feel threatened by Europeans wanting to come into this part of the world. They're afraid of Spain and Portugal trying to come back. And over time, they grow to be afraid of the United States being involved. Okay? So we look at this independence movements, and they're really mostly between 1810 and 1820. You may say, wait a minute, Mr. McKernan. I remember that the United States went independent before all that. How come the United States went first and Latin America came later? Well, it really comes down to class differences and racial differences. What made the Creoles afraid of kicking the Spanish and the Portuguese out was the rest of the people on the continent. What do I mean by that? What I mean is they live in fear that if the Native Americans, if the slaves, if the mixed race people ever realize that they way outnumber the Creoles, the whole system's going to get upset and the Creoles are going to lose. So they don't want that to happen. The wealthy are concerned about losing their power and their position, so they hold off. And a couple things happen that really scare them. There's a uprising, a Native American uprising in Western South America, led by the guy by the name of, yes, Tupac, Tupac. And these kind of things, and some slave uprisings in Brazil and on the islands, particularly what's going to happen in Haiti starting in 1791, really frighten the Creoles of Latin America. So they hold off because they kind of like having the Spanish and the Portuguese armies around, and they're concerned about what will happen if they lose those. Eventually, though, they are pushed to the point that they do revolt. Okay, so what kind of things help cause this political change? Where do they look to for examples? Well, the example they love is the American Revolution. In fact, many historians will argue with you that the American Revolution is not really a revolution. Now, the French Revolution, they'll say that's a real revolution. The American Revolution is really more of an American independence movement. Why would I say that? Well, if you're rich before the American Revolution, if you're a rich landowner, are you still a rich landowner afterwards? Yes. You had slavery before the American Revolution. Do you have slavery after the American Revolution? Yes. If I'm a tenant farmer before the American Revolution, am I still a tenant farmer afterwards? Yes. The only thing that really changed, no social changes really happen. There are no major social changes. The only thing that really happens is who's in charge. So it moves from the wealthy British to aristocratic Americans. Remember, in this time period, in the early part of our country, very few people could vote. You obviously had to be a man, you had to be white, and not only that, you had to own property, and not just a little property. There were property restrictions were fairly high, so it was a very thin sliver of people who actually voted. The French Revolution. Now, that might be inspirational, but it was in a way that made them a little nervous, a little afraid. The French Revolution, now that is a revolution. You see kings getting beheaded. You see aristocrats being beheaded. You see aristocrats losing their feudal privileges. You see land taken from them. And regicide there, that word having to do with the killing of kings, ICIDE, having to do with killing. We know anytime we see that, like insecticide is killing of insects. So regicide is killing of regal people, kings, royal families. That's too much. The other revolution that really scares them during this time, most Creoles in Latin America, is the Haitian Revolution. Now, the Haitian Revolution is really unique in history. This is where a group of slaves, ex-slaves, band together and throw off their owners and their colonizers. They will throw out the French. The French had actually gotten Haiti back during the 7 Years' War. You remember that? 1756 through 1763. The British and French fight. They fight in India. They fight in North America. They fight in Europe. In fact, some will call it the First World War. They had picked up Haiti. And Haiti's pretty profitable for a while because it's a sugar plantation island. And sugar is very profitable during this time period. But they live in fear that if the slaves ever get their act together, they can overthrow them, especially on the islands. It's helpful to remember that on an island like Jamaica, where the British are, slaves or ex-slaves, descendants of slaves, make up over 90% of the population. 5 to maybe 8% of the population are actually British and owners. And their fear is if the other 90% of the people figure out their power, they're done for. So they want to keep British soldiers or Spanish soldiers or Portuguese soldiers on their islands and protecting them. Plus, they're aided by the confused Iberian political situation. What do I mean by that? Well, if you remember, most of these Latin American independence movements happened between 1810 and 1820. or the early 1820s. And Napoleon had, in the early 1800s, before this time period, and in fact up through 1815, had tried to control Europe. And when he's busy out there trying to conquer Europe, it throws Europe into this real mixed up situation where they want to deal with their colonies, but they're busy with each other right now. And that will help out the Haitians. That will help out the Latin American colonies, and it'll even help out the United States. In 1812, the United States will go to war with Britain, and in theory, Britain should have been able to just wipe us out. But they're too busy dealing with Napoleon and the wars in Europe, and we become kind of a second thought, and that happens to these guys. But let's address Spain and Portugal in particular. Spain was actually an ally of Napoleon's. So in the early Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon wants to take Portugal. But in order to get to Portugal, he's got to go through Spain, literally walk through Spain. Spain's an ally, so he asks Spain for permission to go across Spain. Spain says, sure. They don't want to fight him. They're his ally. He goes over. When Portugal knows he's coming, what do the king and queen of Portugal do? If you've read your homework, you know this. That's right. They get on. They and about 10 to 20,000 officials get on boats and head to Brazil, head to Rio. By the way, they really like living in Rio. Good weather, beautiful setting. They like it. So Napoleon takes Portugal. On the way back through Spain, he says to the Spanish leaders, you're still independent, you're still in charge of your own country, but I'm going to put my brother in charge. Now, the Spanish colonies in the Americas look at this and say, oh, Napoleon's brother's not legitimate. We don't have to listen to him. We can do whatever we want. And they will do what they want. Again, because of what's going on in Europe, Europe's distracted, and these colonies will kind of exist on their own. And they'll like it. They'll like doing what they want. Now, when the Spanish get rid of Napoleon and his brother and try to reassert themselves onto the colonies, that's going to cause problems and, again, push them towards revolution. So what was the order of independence in Spanish America? Well, it's kind of reverse order of the way it was settled. Where did the Europeans arrive first? That's right, the Caribbean islands. So they're the last ones to gain their independence. The mainland places are the first. Why? Because the mainland places have more Creoles, and therefore they have more of a chance to push back. The islands, you remember I just spoke about Jamaica, the islands have lots of slaves and a few Spanish or Portuguese descendants, Creoles. And so they don't want to lose the armies because they live in fear of slave rebellions. Okay. Why have so many slaves on the islands? Does anybody remember what's the big lucrative export crop? Sugar. That's right. And between 1820 and 1833, Simón Bolívar, who leads many of these revolutions or independence movements in northern South America, gets his own country named after him. Yep, Bolivia. They're going to, what am I trying to say? They are going to try to create a unified country in northern South America. In fact, the goal of Bolivar was to take all of South America and Central America and combine it as one giant country, so it would be powerful, forceful, world power. Nobody can mess with it. Doesn't work. We'll talk about why later. How did Brazil gain its independence? Now, Brazil's kind of got a unique story. The Spanish places, it pretty much is war every time. And most of the time, the Spanish are not very good at the war. They're better in Mexico, but they're not very good most places. So they lose to the Creoles and their armies and Bolivar. Brazil's a different story. The Portuguese have arrived in Brazil, and by 1850, Napoleon's gone. Do they rush back to Portugal? The royal family, I mean? No. No, they like Brazil. In fact, they'll stay another 4 or 5 years. And it's only after some problems arrive and there's some rioting back in Portugal, then they'll get on boats and go back to Portugal. The king looks at his son, Dom Pedro, and says to him, listen, it looks like, looking around South America, independence movements are coming. So if it's obvious that there's going to be a big independence movement in Brazil, I want you to get out in front. I want you to declare independence, and you can become king. And it's much easier for me as a king to deal with another king. And then we'll retain our influence and all that. And so that's exactly what happens. Dom Pedro realizes what's going on and says, independence. We are now independent of Portugal. I am in charge. We've got a king, and we'll move on. In fact, Brazil is the only one of the Latin American colonies to go to a monarchy, to go to a king and queen. All the others go to the Spanish-speaking ones, all go republics. Now, these republican forms of government, remember republics where you elect people, right? All these republics are not really run by the common people. They're actually run by the large landowners, the aristocrats. The aristocrats will they'll do great, it's a really intelligent thing, kind of bad, but they will actually put the polling places, as they expand voting rights, they'll put the polling places on their plantations. And they will watch their workers come up and vote on their plantation. And they'll know who they vote for. So it's not really controlled by the masses or the main groups, but it is a republic nonetheless. Brazil will go monarchy. I'll talk about that later on. Brazil will actually stay a monarchy until 1888, when the monarchy gets rid of slavery in Brazil. Then the aristocrats are going to be angry that they lost their slaves. They're going to rise up, throw out the king, declare a republic, but by then, slavery's abolished. All right, so what issues do these new nations face? Well, one of the issues they face is, should Catholicism be the national religion? While most of them don't declare Catholicism as a national religion, in reality, that's very much what happens. Should they free the slaves and go egalitarian? No, they decide not to do that. They retain slaves. Do they retain the color distinctions? Yes. Yes, it still remains a very rigid society. It's also going to remain very patriarchal. Why did the unification of Gran Colombia under Simón Bolívar fail? Remember I talked about that? You can see it's where it set then, and you're going to see Colombia break away. And that will there'll be further disintegration when Panama will break away. But there are geographic barriers, mountains, these kind of things. Great distances separate these places. They have poor roads. There are regional differences. There are ethnic differences. There are linguistic differences. And for the mass of the people, they don't really care who's running, because for them, their day-to-day lives are pretty much unaffected. That is the government elites. That's their issue, not theirs. So they don't really care. And eventually, South America will split into Central America, into at least 18 separate nations. All right. So the Latin American countries have kicked out Spain and Portugal. Why don't Spain and Portugal, once they get their acts together, come back and try to recolonize? Or why don't other countries colonize? Well, there's two main reasons. The first is the United States steps up in 1823 and issues the Monroe Doctrine. What does the Monroe Doctrine say? Monroe Doctrine says that any attempt to colonize in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, that's not already colonized, that the way we get around the whole British and Canada thing. If anybody tries to come over and establish new colonies in the Americas, that will be seen as a threat to the United States, and we will respond. And we say, the whole Western Hemisphere is under the protection of the United States. 1823 Monroe Doctrine. Yes. Are we in a position, do we have a Navy that can enforce that in 1823? No, we don't. So who does have a Navy that can enforce that? England, Britain. Great Britain does. And Great Britain will help us with that, will help keep Latin America and the Americas independent. Why, you may ask? What's in it for them? Well, one of the things, if you go back in your brains, remember we had talked about mercantilism. Mercantilism, remember that? Okay, that was where the home countries, the European countries, European countries, will make manufactured goods and finished goods and sell them to their colonies. The colonies will provide raw materials and markets. So these guys get rich while the colonies stay poor. During the independence movements and during the Napoleonic Wars, Spain and Portugal had been unable to enforce their mercantile policies. So what do? They do business, the colonies do business with England. England is starting its industrial revolution and has a lot of finished products. Does England like selling their expensive finished products to the colonies and buying cheap agriculture food from the colonies? They love it. So they don't want to go back to the old way. So they help the United States enforce this. Now, over the next 80 to 100 years, we will eventually become a strong enough Navy we can enforce it. But to be honest, in 1823, we're not there. Okay. So as they gain independence, there is an economic resurgence. Some of that's based on the philosophy of positivism. Positivism is exactly what it sounds like. It's a positive philosophy. It believes that things can get better. That if we use science, if we use logic, if we use the Enlightenment principles, things will get better. All right? So this even applies to human behavior. This says if we study human behavior, if we study governments, we can figure out what the best type of government is. We can figure out how to improve people's lives and make the world a better place. Sounds good. Also in the late 1800s, and I'll talk about this more later on in the chapter, there is a second industrial revolution. You say second industrial revolution, I only thought there was one industrial revolution. Actually, there are multiple steps in the industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution in England, Germany, France, later the United States, has to do with metalworking, iron, steel, and cloth. Clothes, cotton, those kind of things. That's the first industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution comes along in the late 1800s. That involves improvements in chemicals, in electricity, internal combustion engine, improved trains, in cars, airplanes, these kind of things. And with the second industrial revolution, there's also population growth, which requires more food. Latin America is just the place to provide that. But there is some industrialization in Latin America. And as it happens, people accept reforms and move forward. Now, if you look at that little cartoon I've got there, you see the gentleman walking up the mountain, and he goes into the cave to find the wise man. And his question he asks is, how does a person find true happiness? The wise man looks at him and says, how would I know? I haven't even read the latest research yet. The idea being that research and scientific principles will make the world a better place, that we will see advances in that way. All right. So this is where we're going to stop, take a little break, kind of break the chapter up. Please continue your homework and look at chapter 25, part 2 lecture. Thanks. Talk to you soon.